Hello, everyone. This is John Hamm again with Alliance Solutions Group. We're going to go ahead and start the webinar. We appreciate everybody taking time today to come and get some good advice about what we can do to pay attention to how our businesses are operating, and folks from sales are going to tell us what goes wrong in them from time to time. For those of you who are not familiar with Alliance, we are the Sage Timberline and Sage Master Builder software resellers in Florida, Texas, and California. We work with about 4,000 construction companies that currently have our software products. And we have a long relationship with the folks from Fails going back. I've been working with them for over 20 years, and they're going to be conducting the seminar today, the webinar today. And we're going to be going ahead and introducing the players. Greg Shopman from Fails is going to be our leader today, and he's been with Fails for about 8 years, and he is the manager of the Florida office for Fails. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Greg to go ahead and get started and put it in his good hands, and we'll go from there. Greg, you ready?
Yes, sir. Thank you, John. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope everyone is enjoying this Friday. We were discussing ahead of time how wonderful this lack of a winter has been, especially here in Florida, where it's about 88 degrees. So hopefully the rest of you are having a great Friday and preparing for the weekend. Albeit this topic, why contractors fail, it sounds like a very ominous Fox movie special where we're going to talk about why contractors don't succeed. So if anything, some of the takeaways in this webinar I'd like you to really focus on is what can we learn from failure? Why are we doing this autopsy of some organizations, and what were the compelling things that FMI found in their study? As we go through, I do still see some people kind of coming on board for today's program. Obviously, you've all been muted, so we don't have a lot of different noises going around. But I would just ask if you have any questions at the end of the session. There is a box on the bottom, I believe, where you can ask me any questions. You also see my email address at the end with an absolutely hideous picture of me in case you really feel that you need to have the 3D experience. But we'll be more than happy to push this out to anybody because there's a lot of data, a lot of information. There's a lot of slides. And hopefully this coupled with a white paper that FMI drafted will give you some information. The good news is we also have other corroborating white papers that kind of go along with this program today. Why people succeed, as well as one of the new featured white papers, which is about adjusting, adapting to this new world that we live in. So some good complementary pieces that will hopefully help your business. As I mentioned, we'll be going through, but I just want to thank, first of all, Alliance Solutions for providing us this platform to share some information and give you some knowledge for this great Friday afternoon. So, why contractors fail? Some of the things we're going to go through today, I'm going to throw a couple names up on the board here. A couple things that we probably want you to be thinking about. Many of you have worked with or have friends that have worked with large contractors that have gone belly up. Some of these names probably look familiar, and you say, where did I see those folks? And why don't I see them currently? Obviously, if we had maybe done this study 10 years ago, maybe these companies would have been here and they wouldn't have gone the way of the dinosaur. In some cases, within this profile of this program, some of these firms have emerged from bankruptcy. Some have been acquired by competitors. Some have gone through complete liquidation. And even with this current recession that we're in, we're currently seeing a new round of failures. Maybe not what we expected, maybe a little longer than we expected. But I think the key theme that we've got to recognize is this is part of the business life cycle. I was speaking with a fire protection contractor yesterday afternoon, and they said, we're doing fairly well right now. Obviously, we're very nervous just because of the uncertainty in the world. We use the word VUCA. That's V-U-C-A, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's an acronym that basically we're using to describe the level of uncertainty that we see. And yes, there is another round of fallout. This happens, and new competitors. It's sort of like the circle of life to some extent. But as we go through this, one of the things that I want you to start to recognize, calling it setting the tone for today, we want you to understand or recognize some of the risks, be able to feel, identify. Hopefully no one on this webinar today is experiencing any of the things we're talking about, but if anything else, we can learn from others' failure. So as we go forward, why are we studying this? What are the compelling reasons? First of all, one of the big things we've got to look at is there are people that make mistakes. We can make differences. What we want to avoid is what we refer to as the doom loop. In the short term, we want to understand the large contractor failure. What are the root causes? I'm a huge favorite of that show CSI. And depending on whether you're a CSI Vegas or a CSI Miami, whatever it might be, but you're looking for the evidence, not just simply that you got the dead body, but more importantly, what are the things that led up to that? What caused that to occur? So hopefully we can prevent it in the future. Our objectives in the long run, improving the endurance and the longevity of contractors and developing potentially some dashboards for measures. Some of the things that we have to recognize, when we did this study, it was several years ago. And what's fascinating is we're now dusting it off, for lack of a better word, and reminding people these are the trends. And what's fascinating is the failures that are going to occur, especially as we start to go through the growth or the recovery part of this wonderful economy we're in, we will see failure. And it's not going to be because of the recession necessarily, but because of the growth. And we'll get a little bit more into that as we go. So some of what we did and how we actually came up with this, there was an extensive amount of research. First of all, we looked at a wide range of resources. First of all, we started getting our hands on every article or book that we could find, conducted one-on-one interviews with company executives, construction university academics. As we started to pool this together, we brought our senior team of FMI consultants that, once again, have examined not only the good, but the bad and the ugly as well. And everything from our experience to the surety data, academic research, plus these 80-plus failure studies, financial models, all gave us the information which we have today. So what we've done since, we looked at, we actually covered 25 of these failed companies, representing a wide range of industry segments, interviews with 35 very specific executives, and as well as 6 relevant books on the subject. One of the data points that we also used was the Risk Management Association data that covers the construction industry. We also looked at an intra-industry analysis of Myers-Briggs. Some of you are probably familiar with ProScan, DISC, Predictive Index, all these different personality profiles. This will become much more apparent in a moment, as well as a nationwide survey of industry participants. So with this background, and those of you that have read the book Good to Great, Jim Collins spent a great deal of time elaborating on how he kind of whittled down his pool to figure out those firms that were in fact good to great. This gives you a little background on the idea. So first and foremost, what were the most cited causes for failure? The 3 big buckets that I like to kind of focus on are the strategic, organizational, uncontrollable. From a strategic standpoint, we're talking about things like no innovation, abandoning their core business, too many acquisitions, no plan for slowdowns, excuse me. Some of the organizational factors, the senior team composition wasn't adequate, their organizational design, the talent shortage, all the things that go into just a poor structure for which to actually execute work. Then when you talk about the uncontrollable, obviously, a good example, this economic downturn gives some perspective. National labor market inflexibility, regulatory antitrust actions, currency fluctuations. But when we look at this list, some of the things that we have to recognize, these top 2 pieces are very much within our control. For instance, unrealistic growth, overexpansion, unfamiliarity with new markets, and entry into new types of construction. There is a growth obsession in our industry. We often ask people, which would you rather be, a $100 million contractor making 5% or a $50 million contractor making 10%? And while all 23 of you probably know the right answer, you wouldn't be surprised how many times we hear the 100 million. The bigger is better. Let's focus on that. That top line or volume obsession rather than the bottom line profit obsession. And I think it's very important to recognize, now this is not an anti-growth message. I want to make that abundantly clear. What we do want people to recognize is the simple fact that expansion for expansion's sake with no strategic direction is very dangerous. You know, then we start getting into making these unrealistic promises, bad contract, poor project selectivity, no presence of a go, no-go criteria. All those things that, once again, especially now as people have seen maybe their market dwindle, the knee-jerk reaction to go into a new market. You know, organizational, we're talking about insufficient capital or profits to finance any directional moves. Lack of business acumen, poor financial management, poor sales, inadequate marketing. This whole second bullet on organization is very, very important, because what's fascinating when you look at the organizational or business acumen, it's amazing to see. I mean, most of your construction firms, trade partners, very technically skill-oriented, heavy on the engineering, building construction skills, not so much on the business side. And as I see it, I work a lot within the project execution sector, talking about project managers understanding about cash flow. If there was a good thing to this recession, and there are several good things that I've recognized, is the ability of contractors, or more importantly, their refocus on things like cash flow, asking the questions, are we getting paid? Very important question to ask. Poor leadership transfer. You know, I'm sure some of the folks on this call will actually resemble the kind of the aging workforce, the aging executive. So who is going to take over your business? Who's going to run your business when you're gone? And in some cases, I have countless examples of contractors that have kind of an indomitable spirit and also the belief that they're never going to die, and never truly focus on this strategic perspective. Who is going to take over not only your role as the president or the CEO, but what about specific leadership positions within your firm? What about your operations manager, your chief estimator? And unfortunately, we wait too long to make some of these key decisions. You know, project losses, poor project performance. Unfortunately, you know, when we're making money hand over fist, the focus on productivity, the focus on efficiency and lean practices isn't where it needs to be. In some cases, I have companies that make money in spite of themselves, but that's not something that will sustain, nor will it be forever. So you need to focus on that. Owner court battles, owner bankruptcy, I can tell you the only folks that win at this point are the attorneys. So when we look at this list of information that we have here, let's take a next step and look at some of what we call the failure chain reaction model that led to this doom loop. You know, after reviewing our initial resource, we built this model of the process. You know, we organized the variety of causes of failure for large construction firms into 4 categories: the mind of the contractor, the nature of the construction industry, general economic conditions, and the culture and systems of the organization. Let's look at these first 3 for a moment. The nature of the construction industry. You know, a couple good examples that I think pretty much kind of emphasize this. You know, the derived demand, we can't inspire spending. I mean, it's definitely one of the bigger issues that we have. It's a very high-risk industry. It's a highly competitive with few barriers to entry. One of the jokes that we have with a couple of my contractor friends here in Florida is you don't need a whole lot to be a contractor. Usually just a pit bull and a pickup truck, and really the pickup truck is optional. You know, low capitalization relative to the project size. You know, the moral of the story is we're not talking about opening up the next Google or Microsoft. It's a very easy industry to get into, and unfortunately, it's also an easy industry to exit just as quick. The general economic conditions, rising interest rates, global economic changes and competition, surety policy changes, workforce limitations, union restrictions. I mean, all these things, when we look at these silver globes on the right-hand side of this equation, all definitely external factors, but things that are impacting our business nonetheless. Lastly, in the first three that we want to talk about, culture and systems of the organization, poor change in ownership, dysfunctional public ownership, poor owner project and subcontractor selection process, poor human resources practices, lack of organizational learning, poor strategic planning, stagnant, bloated, inflexible and unhealthy corporate structure, lack of financial discipline and control, and also low cash reserves, running on a very razor-thin margin. One of the pieces I do want to focus on in this one, when we talk about these stagnant, bloated, inflexible structures, almost taking on the resemblance of a large bureaucracy. And I want to stress here, this is very important, the tone that we need to set moving forward from 2012 to 2013 and beyond is going to be nimble, being quick. Not quick just to jump and make change for change's sake, but having the ability to be flexible. And you see countless businesses that unfortunately resemble that of a bureaucratic organization or an agency within the government. No offense to any government folks on the line, but there is definitely something to be recognized and say, are we as nimble? And there's a phenomenal book, and I'm going to mangle the title, but basically it goes something like this. It's not the big that eat the small, it's the fast that eat the slow. And I can't give the author the exact citation because I don't remember who exactly wrote it, but that name has always stuck, or the title of the book has stuck with me. So the first three that I've kind of described, the two silver and this bottom blue, once again, I don't think there's a lot of shock to that. But there is something with this upper left-hand corner, and you're probably wondering, what are we talking about there? The mind of the contractor. Some of the things here, poor management, poor leadership, inadequate business skills, dysfunctional leaders, a flawed worldview, very ego-driven, ignorantly overconfident. As we went through and we started examining this further and further, these are the things that came up. And the one key that we want to recognize here is, first of all, one factor by itself is not going to kill you. I think this is, to simply say, oh my gosh, we have an egocentric contractor leader, that means we're going in this bankruptcy doom loop. No, that's not the case. What we are saying here is when we start to add and compound the inherent nature of the business, a recessionary environment, union disputes, and increase in government legislation, coupled with a lack of a company system, that's when we start to create and compound the effect. So some of the other things as we continue to move on here, let's start to look at the nature of the construction industry. And these are some of the starting points that we've already kind of talked a little bit about. At this point, there really is no prioritization. This isn't necessarily in the order we're talking. But when we talk about we're highly leveraged. Most of these businesses, unfortunately run very shoestring. We're not a high margin business to begin with. But the key thing that I want to recognize here is when we start talking about the margins and the risk, we're talking a 2 to 4% net profit margin. Now, some of you may say, we're better than that, Greg. What are you talking about? That's great. But I would tell you the data that we've seen, and actually in some cases it may be lower, in some cases it may be higher. You could look at RMA and CFMA. The list goes on. But what I want to simply have you recognize is this. We're low margin. Some of you probably get that. If I was to go out to your crews right now and ask them the question, what type of margin business are you? You'd be surprised at the numbers you hear if you were to walk up to a carpenter or walk up to an equipment operator, a finisher. They would probably say, and I've actually done this, I've heard numbers between 50 and 60% net profit margin. They think when you're not on a webinar, you're actually out there printing money in the back room. And the thing that we want you to realize is, I'm not saying leave your income statement in the coffee table in your break room, but what I would say is it's important for us to get people to understand what a risky business this is, how leveraged we actually are, and when you marry that to the risk-reward ratio starts to make you wonder why we even do this to some extent. But when we also look at the second bullet, I want to let you understand, you're probably saying manpower shortage, Greg. I thought the construction industry unemployment ratio was somewhere about 17 to 18%. I realize we have different states in audience right now. What I will say is this, folks, we are in a labor shortage, and I can tell you how many times I've gone around, people cannot find good people. Whether it's a good estimator, I would say our universities are doing an excellent job of training, or excuse me, let me rephrase that, educating our future managers and estimators of the world. My biggest concern is from a direct production resource. And when we take on these contracts, we take on this work, and as this economic recession ends and the recovery continues to go forward, where are we going to get the people from? Those are very important. These first two pieces alone probably have a lot of people shaking in their boots. When you couple the industry cycle, now the good news is there was a great article, I think, in it was ENR as well as in our local paper about just the weather and how this is impacted. But when you look at a traditional weather cycle, we're talking about if you're working in Chicago, you're shutting down. Well, that does a lot to impact your manpower. Where are you going to get those people where every time we have to, the ebb and flow cycle continues? The hard bid process, the risk that it carries. And the more and more that we get in, we start to figure out that the only one that wins the project is the one who actually has has made the most mistakes. Project timing, when you start to tie this back to that hard bid process and not doing it in an integrated environment. But yet we're worried about being fast track. And it's amazing, we probably don't use fast track as much as we used to. In fact, we probably don't use it at all because everything has become fast track. Hyper competitive, unique projects. I think we get the main gist of the nature of the industry. The general economic conditions, interest rates, material shortages, and we're talking here as we watch some of your industries that are being adversely affected by fuel cost. Those heavy equipment contractors, I have quite a few contractors that I work with in the paving industry, not only from an equipment but from a just raw asphalt. The state of the global economy, this interconnectivity. Thomas Friedman would be proud to hear me say the world is definitely flat. And more importantly, we're so connected now. We're watching what happens in the Middle East and seeing what happens every day in China, what's happening in Japan, and all these things definitely connect. Bonding status. This is scary information to watch some of the surety firms out there start to fail. Now, once again, much like we see our contractors that fail, we could probably do an equally interesting study on the bonding status. Demographics. This is going back to that labor workforce piece. The desire of people to come into this business. We're not doing an exceptionally good job as an industry of really attracting top talent. There are many, many studies that have shown that when we start looking at demographics, we're somewhere in the high 250s in terms of desired places to work. I saw one study where construction worker was just below migrant farm worker. So that brings a question. How do we increase our attractiveness to new people coming in the business? Can we do that? And I think that's something we should recognize, because one of the big things, we start to see material shortages, and this gets into this whole Michael Porter's 5 forces equation. Now, unfortunately, we're going to be paying an inflated rate for labor if we're not too careful, because we're not developing that supplemental level of talent. Our wonderful tax law, I'm sure everyone is watching with bated breath what will happen during this election year. We're not even going to go there in this discussion, but obviously this is always something that comes back. And then consumer confidence. In terms of, we build facilities, we build commercial stores, we build schools, we build ALF facilities, all these things, but if people aren't buying, are we necessarily building? Then we start to get more internal, and we start to looking at the culture and systems of the organization, financial discipline, succession planning, selectivity of our projects and our customers, innovation. Do we, in fact, innovate? I have so many of my clients that talk about innovation. Unfortunately, the real benchmark of innovation is going out to the people in your business. Ask one of your receptionists, or ask a line worker and say, hey, when was the last time you were encouraged to innovate? Very important question, because once again, you may have it on the back of your business card. You may have it on your website or a placard in your conference room. But, folks, you're not innovative unless your people are innovating, and that's actually pushed down to them. Strategic planning. We see it countless times. We're asked to help contractors in their strategic planning process create the mission, vision, and values. But are you living and breathing it and making it a dynamic document, or is it something that sits on the shelf and we, once again, just put that placard up on our wall? Do we have the capital reserves, the financing, or are we running so thin that unfortunately we're writing checks just because we got checks in the checkbook, but we don't necessarily have money in the bank? What are our HR systems? I can tell you, the old model of if you can fog a mirror, you can come work here, that is not a good HR system. In fact, I was working with a client fairly recently in the Midwest, and I said to them, you're going to have to improve your model. You're going to have to create a little more depth to your process, screening, testing, personality assessments. And their HR director looked at me and he said, Craig, he actually chuckled. He said, what do you think we are, Google? We're a construction firm. And I said, that's the reason you fail. We take such a mediocre view, or manage to mediocrity was what I was trying to say. And unfortunately, when we don't take the view that, why can't we be like Google? As I look at the Fortune 500 list that came out of the top places to work in the United States, 3 of the top 25, I believe, were construction companies. DPR, Balfour Beatty, there was a third one in there as well. Interestingly enough, here are companies in our industry that said, it's okay to be a desirable place to work, and they get the top talent. And I can assure you, they also have not only the top work right now, the higher margins, but more importantly, they have access to the talent pool that most of the people would love to have. And that's a very important piece. What's interesting in that Fortune list of best companies to work for, the third one, I believe, is Zappos. And some of you may or may not know this. I did a program in Richmond, Virginia yesterday, and we talked about this. Zappos is an online shoe sales company. When I think of shoe sales, I think of Al Bundy, if you remember the old Married with Children. Obviously, a little antiquated model there. But I find it interesting that a shoe company can be in the top 5, yet we worry about, do we need to think like Google? I say yes. Public versus private, obviously there's not a large number of publicly traded construction organizations, mainly because a lot of people don't have the stomach for it. But when you look at it's a very shaped like a pyramid when you look at the public versus private. A small couple at the top, but largely family-owned businesses with the succession issues that we talked about. Lastly, the mind of the contractor. And let me tell you, if anything hits home, folks, the things I want you to be thinking about are on this list. Driven to grow, numb to risk, hyper-optimistic, overconfident, afraid of layoffs, action-oriented. The PM versus the CEO model. Am I a manager or am I a leader? And there is a huge difference. I can manage projects all day long, but can I necessarily manage the direction of the firm? In a lot of cases, we see this feast or famine. It looks like a sine or a cosine curve, if you remember that from way back in trigonometry days. When we look at this, do we necessarily, we seem to have all the work in the world where we're just a glutton, and unfortunately we have to throttle back our sales effort, and then we go down into a trough. Once again, the mind of the contractor. And interestingly enough, a lot of the things that make some organizations great is the same blue circle, the mind of the contractor. But once again, taken in the right doses. That's the key here. When we look at these, 8 different items, if you take these to the extreme, unfortunately, we get caught in this failure chain reaction model. Some of the things we heard during our interview process is very important. We keep our guys busy. We'll make it up on change orders, Greg. We need to put our people to work. And my favorite is this 4th one. For any attorneys that are on the line, you'll love this one. We're right, and we'll win it in court. Unfortunately, we're not going to see Judge Wapner, and all the attorneys I've ever met charge a fair amount. just put more people on it. Folks, there is a law of diminishing returns. The more bodies we put on a job doesn't necessarily mean our productivity will go up, but I can guarantee your cost will. We'll figure out how to staff it once we get the job. And that's where we get caught up into that. We'll fog a mirror, and that's the job application process. We'll make it happen, and we'll show them what we're made of. That won't affect our market. Boy, oh boy. I had so many clients in the condo market say, this thing will never end. This irrational exuberance, concern with this is always going to be the way it is. And it's amazing to watch the cycles in construction, the cycles of our economy. This last one, I'm not sure where our work will come from next month, much less next year. I realize that this is an issue right now, especially in this VUCA world that we live in, that volatility. However, if the captain of the ship doesn't know where the ship is going, how can the rest of the people on the ship know whether or not to turn on the engine, turn on the lights? What do we need to do? So these are some of the quotes, and hopefully no one has ever caught themselves saying this. Very dangerous piece. I'm sorry. Some of the other things when we start going into the doom loop, so to speak, we're talking about this ego, the no strategic plan. Well, with no plan, what tends to happen is we overexpand. We don't necessarily put limits on what direction we're going, which, unfortunately, we start to expand. So what do we need to do? We need to go out and hire a bunch of people, people that may or may not fit our corporate culture. I have countless examples of contractors that, unfortunately, went out and got the high-priced free agents. Unfortunately, they probably would have been better suited developing a farm system, but it's all about time. We need bodies now. We need a PM. We need a superintendent. We need 12 estimators and a Pied Piper, whatever we need. So what happens? We bring in people that don't necessarily fit our culture. They don't fit our model, and we experience project losses. We see this margin erosion. Well, you couple that, and then all of a sudden we start doing some crazy things with our financial management model where we're not managing cash the right way. We're not collecting projects. We're unfortunately underbilled, and we're having to, at that point in time, go out and get more cash. Unfortunately, in a tighter financial market, as policies have changed, leading us to no cash, which simply means we can't pay our people. We can't pay ourselves. We can't run a sustaining business. While this is neither groundbreaking and probably makes a lot of sense, you'd be surprised, this first piece, where we just think we know where we're going. I've been in this business for 30 years. What kind of plan do I need? Folks, I'm not necessarily saying you got to sit here and create a very verbose strategic plan, but at least you have to have something in your mind. What direction are we going? Because the key is, and one of the things I always like to say, is think about, if you remember the movie Troy or the movie 300, the Trojans and all the folks, the Greeks, they used boats that were called triremes. And the trireme boat had a lot of those oars that were sticking out of the side. They were very fast boats, not the most structurally sound, but they were very fast. And because they had all those oars and some sails, but could you imagine if the captain didn't direct that ship where to go? Yet the person on the left-hand side of the ship thinks he's doing everything he should be doing. Meanwhile, the young lady on the right, she's rowing at the rate of speed she thinks she should be going. Unfortunately, there's a lot of activity on the boat, but because they're not actually communicating and no one is providing them the stroke count, we're all working in an active, but we could end up having that boat go around in circles. And once again, there's difference between being active and necessarily having a productive plan. So what can we say? There are a few principal root causes for the majority of the largest downfalls. These root causes often occur together. You know, it's kind of like all of a sudden being diagnosed with cancer and having a stroke and a heart attack in a series of events. The root causes do not always occur in the same time sequence. So once again, when we look at the time frame that we're working on here, we could start having that hyperactivity. We could see an increased influx in our work, but without the process and procedures, we start to see margin erosion. So we think we need to go out and get more work because that'll solve all our problems. So very important things to recognize. The next couple slides that we're going to talk about, we go back to our original model, you know, in terms of company performance. You know, some of the things when we talk about in terms of the financial doom loop, the loss of the financial capacity. So we're talking about the financial capacity model. We overpaid for acquisition. We have excess overhead. And I hear so many organizations blame everything on this one, the excess overhead. And in a lot of cases, I hear the word lean. And unfortunately, I'm not talking about the lean that's affecting efficiency and productivity or Lean Six Sigma. We operate, unfortunately, bare bones. When we talk about, unfortunately, how we have a excessive overhead with owner buyout, and we're trying to get that next generation, but unfortunately we can't because we don't have a model that makes sense. We're laden with debt. We have late projects, high legal costs. The moral of this slide is we can start to see we're starting to build on one another, and it does create an interesting model. So some of the causes, and when we actually went through the model, and as I kind of go back to the original slides where we talked about our research, what were some of the answers that we saw and that led to these failures? And I think for the most part, when you look at this information, 62% related to this poor strategic leadership, excessive ego, too much change, loss of discipline, inadequate capitalization. Some of the biggest things, though, were 76% of the cases of failure, by our definition of failure, there was some poor strategic leadership, some dysfunctional leadership in some cases. Excessive ego, 62% of the interviews. This is an interesting one again. We're going to take over the world. Definitely an interesting model. Let's talk about ego for a second. This is that mind of the contractor stuff. We've heard enough, or we've heard a lot about what we're talking about when we mean excessive ego. We can do anything model. It's also called a cultural dysfunction disease, an arrogance, ignorance syndrome, whatever you want to call it. Not paying attention to event risk. All our architects design monuments but not making money on things. I think we see it, especially when we have a project that's right outside of our building. Well, we have to get that one, and it's amazing. We get that. But 62% of the interviews, when we start to look at some of the failures, in particular, one that comes to mind was the modern continental failure. The excessive growth, we're going to do the big dig, and we're going to take over everything. And I think it's very important to recognize, interestingly enough, this is a psychological or sociological issue, not necessarily an MBA model or even a structural failure in the terms of concrete or steel. We're talking a personality failure. Definitely interesting. We're talking about pride, showing what we can do, and arrogance, and over-optimism, and invincibility, a captain of industry. When you look at the ENR Top 400 list, we rate contractors based on volume, not necessarily on the other line. We joke at that at FMI that it's often that if we were to flip the list, we'd actually probably see the true measure, meaning we would base people based on their net profit margins, not based on their volume. But once again, we like seeing our name in lights, and because of that, we tend to be numb to risk and blind to realities. And unfortunately, we're not doing a good job developing a team. When we are so, call it the level 4 leadership from the Jim Collins model, where we are that grandiose, egocentric leader, we may be doing amazing things in the business, but we're not focused on the actual development of a next generation in our business. And this is incredibly, incredibly important. No one to challenge and give candid feedback. Do you allow that next layer within your business to comment, talk about things, to challenge assumptions, to say, hey, this is not the right direction we should be going. And I see a lot with peer groups. Once again, that when you get those CEOs together and you have them talking, they can at least challenge one another. But does your company have an existence where they can challenge one another? And that's important. So no need to change, numbness, dumbness syndrome, all the things we're talking about here. Why CEO fails, or why CEOs fail, excuse me. We got a lot of fail here going on right now. Some of the other pieces, and the key line here is this level of arrogance. Dr. Dotlich and Cairo, Dr. Finkelstein, actually, since the original research that FMI has done, Jim Collins has also published a book, basically why organizations fail. So, and largely this one comes back, that excessive ego piece. Competing for the future, Gary Hamel, this is he's a phenomenal author, by the way. He has a new book out called What Matters Now. That's a great, great book. When we look at this information, the inability to escape the past and the inability to invent the future, I think this is the key thing. We get caught up in these legacy organizations that unfortunately we're caught in almost the pulling forces, the diopposed magnetic forces of, we're trying to figure out what to do in the future, but we're too stuck to the past. But unfortunately, we can't escape the past to actually look to the future. And it's kind of a paradox to some extent. But when you look through this particular slide, it definitely gives you some information. But I highly encourage you. Gary Hamel is largely regarded as the next Jim Collins, a phenomenal author. Why bad things happen to good strategies. McKinsey Quarterly spent a lot of time looking at this as well. And I'm sure you can probably find equal research in Harvard Business Review. Overconfidence and overoptimism. There's that word again. Mental accounting, status quo bias. Once again, this is the way we've always done it, Greg. I can tell you in all our project execution work, we routinely hear that. This is the way we've always done it. Unfortunately, if you're a 100-year organization, that's not necessarily what's going to get you to where you need to be. The sunk cost effect, the herding instinct, the misestimating future hedonic states, false consensus, all the things that relate to, why bad things happen to good strategies. Distortions and deceptions in strategic decisions, another McKinsey Quarterly piece. Over-optimism, loss aversion, overconfidence, misaligned time horizons. The champion bias. We see this quite a bit. The people that necessarily led the initiative, of course they think it's the right direction to go. The sunflower management, once again, the sun is always shining on the direction that we want. So additionally, we did an online survey. Some of these quotes that we talked about, we asked people to actually give us their answer and how they would look at this. And when you look at the red, yellow, and green, this is folks that either had a financial crisis, low risk of financial crisis, and least risk of financial crisis, how they answer these questions. Once again, we still see it. We'll figure out how to staff it once we get the job. 75% of the respondents that said this also had a financial crisis. So are people necessarily learning? And there's a lot of great information on this slide. As I mentioned already, I'll be more than happy to email this slide deck out to anybody, because once again, there is a lot of information on it. Poor strategic leadership, 76% of the interviews. I think, the wrong person. There are many examples, and I actually had one fairly recently, as soon as this morning, actually. The owner versus renter syndrome. There's something to be said for someone who has a vested interest in the business, someone that is truly a bona fide owner versus someone that is just simply renting. And I think that's a very important key, as well as this absentee leadership. Folks that unfortunately they're not around, they're not seeing what's going on. It's kind of like captaining the ship, but being on another ship. And are you able to make the right strategic discussions or decisions and discussions, as well as making timely decisions? Very important piece. Poor strategic leadership. Once again, very well kind of laid out here, and we use the same criteria from the previous one. Is well disciplined. For the folks that, if they're well disciplined, they also had the least risk of financial. And when we're talking about well disciplined, it means we're chasing the right things. And without going through each question and item ad nauseum, I think you can quickly start to see that the folks that had the stronger understanding of their business, that understood, that were truly intimate and making objective decisions, had a better handling, and also were at the least risk of a financial crisis. And conversely, the folks in red, they were not exhibiting those behaviors. Too much change. We see this in many organizations. We see a new paradigm, we got to run out and chase it. We see a new market, we got to get in it. Do we necessarily have the corroborating skills to be in that? That's a better question. Too much change, we're talking about new volume, new markets, new leaders that we may bring in. new supervision, new labor, new owners, new geography, new bad jobs. All these pieces, and once again, not one in itself, but it could easily be a complication of a series of these. New types of projects, acquisitions, systems, cultures, contract types. There's an exponential impact when you start to add on layers of these newness items. Too much change, there is definitely a change limit, speed limit. Change, unless properly prepared for, draws resources away from the activities currently in place to keep the business under control. So let's talk about this for a second. Too much change. First of all, when we look at this particular slide, visually this is the way we look at it. As the amount of change occurs, the resources required to accommodate changes goes up. On the other hand, the resources available to accommodate the change go down. There's a point where these two lines cross, and you can kind of see it right here in the middle of the screen. It's called the inflection point. If the change pushes beyond the limit, then you simply have a disconnect. There's too many things happening too fast. Things start to fall through the cracks. People get overwhelmed, and the job does not get done to the right level that needs to be getting done. And this was a huge item that kept happening over and over again throughout the study. A lot of change, and unfortunately, we didn't have the resources necessary to take advantage of that. Too much change, very similar survey that we talked about. As you can see here, very aggressive, regularly makes changes, overburdens the company. 15% versus the 53% gives you some perspective. Very similar information as we go down the line. Rate of change is slow and steady, which is just right for the company. There is an assimilation curve that people have to recognize. And I have many clients, unfortunately, that they'll come to a seminar that we present or a peer group meeting, and we hear a lot of great things. And we go, well, I'm going to go back and kind of take care of all this. And that'd be the equivalent of, if any of you have any of these vices, that would be like stop smoking, start exercising, eating healthy, maybe stop drinking, stop swearing, all at the same time. Not to mention, you'd probably be a pretty irritable person if you tried to make all those life changes simultaneously, albeit they're probably good for you. There is the point where you might fail, and then what happens is the organization starts to see that. Are you necessarily, and you try to enact a new change, do people necessarily have the credibility or belief that you can make it happen? But once again, if the captain is saying change, or change course, but we keep changing, are we necessarily moving forward like we should? 20% of the interviewees reported the too slow problem. We have this in a lot of cases as well, where we don't adapt to the marketplace. We see things coming, we see the boulder coming down the hill, or if you ever remember those Austin Powers movies, there's one scene where the enemy is going to get run over by a steamroller. And it's coming, and it's going at about a mile an hour. But the guy's about 60 feet away, and he's screaming, oh, my gosh, it's coming. We see this coming, but do we get out of the way? And I think that's an important piece to recognize. Loss of discipline. 45% of the interviews said this was a challenge for their business. We focused on keeping people busy. I could also put in here our iron busy, our project selection, our pricing, bureaucracy. Much of these are the similar things that we talked about, but I like this last line. We have to feed the beast. We have 500 people on staff. We got 20 people on staff. We got to make sure they're still here. Size, in terms of the loss of touch or the division of the labor, overextended management, the bigger you grow, can management necessarily touch all those parts and pieces? And the answer is no. But I think that the important piece that you have to recognize is we have to find a way to make sure we're still connected. And the further out we go in the organization, are we still present? The no standardized process, or more importantly, the brand X way of doing things. And I challenge the people that are on this webinar now. Is there a way in your business how to manage projects, how to supervise projects, way to hire, way to train? Is there a pre-job planning way, a short interval planning way? Because, folks, this is one of the easiest things you can control, albeit, as we say in the South, says easy, does hard, but this will help you, and something you have to focus on. You need the standardization. I know that's a horrible word, but we got to have it. Lose focus, and we stray from our expertise. We get too far away from the farm, so to speak. and then underutilize our financial discipline. We're not focused on our collecting. We're not focused on managing our cash. We talk about the loss of discipline, least at risk of having a financial crisis. In this case, we're talking a percent of respondents who stated yes or generally yes to this statement. Our company is or was consistently good about keeping its eye on the ball. And once again, we know where the target is, we know where the bogey is, and we constantly focus on that versus we had a financial crisis and unfortunately we weren't thinking necessarily that far ahead. Very similar to the other pieces of the survey that we've talked about, has employees that are very self-disciplined. We don't need necessarily to manage these people because, once again, there is the structure that allows them to be successful. That's a very important piece to this. We train them in our model. We show them the right way. I think these are some of the key things that, a lot of people think, well, I got to have a bunch of superstars. No, I would say make sure you have the structure and hold people accountable, and we could probably make a B player an A player by making sure we have that structure. And it's probably a lot easier to get that than it is necessarily trying to find superior A people. But I think it's somewhat lazy of organizations to not focus on creating that brandable, scalable model. Inadequate capitalization, 58% of the interviews talked about little contingency or reserves. And this is interesting. It really mirrors what we see in the world today. There was a CNN program that talked about how few people actually carry cash reserve if they were to get unemployed or hit a financial crisis. It's very similar to these businesses. We worry about litigation, but simply because we can't afford to settle. We have large duration projects where a large portion of our equity is tied up, and our working capital is related to profit recognition from uncompleted work or claims. So we're not making money till those change orders are signed off. And unfortunately, when we see businesses wait till the 11th hour to get a change order signed off, we're not being proactive. And folks, I get it. I know there are plenty of customers that we're never going to pay you. I understand that, but we need to be a lot more proactive in that, because especially if this is where our money is made at this point. And then there's also the pressure to show profits. I've seen that countless times, especially as we start talking about publicly traded. We have to maintain, show our bonding company, show our bank, show our shareholders, whatever it might be. And I understand that. This is what we're in the business for. I've seen some unrealistic expectations and with pressure on profitability, but we'll talk about that in another session. Ownership-related capital depletion, paying for the fleet of helicopters and boats, diversification into illiquid assets, surety availability. Most of this, is under the assumption that we think this is a easy business with no bad luck and not saving for the rainy day. Phantom capital. When we start talking about underbillings, overbillings, unfortunately we're overbilled, but unfortunately we're not actually, we don't have the cash to show it. Estimated cost to complete, yet we're still showing profit fade. Book claims, are we being unrealistic, think we're going to get all the claims or forced accounts. Unsigned change orders, versus the scope. And if we're a labor-intensive contractor, what does that impact our labor budget? Unresolved litigation, for or against. I think these are all the other pieces of the inadequate capital, coupled with old receivables, collectible, failed subcontractors, and we're seeing a higher propensity of this in 2012, capitalized versus expense items, profit impact, and then goodwill. Really? Are we talking about goodwill? Now there are some contractors, I will give you that all day long. And folks, there are others that I'll say, goodwill, we're lucky if we can even spell goodwill. So some of the other pieces we want to make sure of is that when we look at these two that we have here, the nature of the industry and the general economic conditions, they're not root causes. If anything, they just simply accelerate the problem or the severity. Mistakes can be deadly and often are. What we're saying in this case, when we have a catastrophic mistake in this business, it's generally unforgiving. And there's been more liquidations than reorganizations. I think that's a very important piece to note. The real causes behind the cause. We start to get into this poor strategic leadership again. The excessive ego, too much change, the loss of discipline, and inadequate capitalization. led to poor financial performance and margin erosion or capital erosion that is then exacerbated by the nature of the industry and general economic conditions, thus leads to failure. Here is the key, folks. With that poor strategic leadership, through our study, that's where it began. It ended here, and a lot of people will blame these two silver discs when, in fact, it's further upstream, and very important for us to recognize. So, why do we have no U.S.-based mega firms anymore? In theory, obviously, we have the Turners and the Skanskas out there, and some of these are not U.S.-owned, which is important to note. You know, first of all, it's tough competition. It's tough sledding out there. The shortage of growth capital, the surety underwriting standards that currently exist, the price-driven selection criteria, and then low barriers to entry. It comes back to there are a lot of folks that can be contractors that, once again, maybe you're a little bit more nimble than the mega firms that exist. You know, no economies of scale. There's this heavy international competitive angle right now. A lot of international dollars flooding the United States once again. Why? Because the dollar is so cheap. Domestic opportunity. There's also the generational transition piece that we still struggle with. We're talking about family-owned businesses, and we're not doing the greatest job. You know, the high ego, high risk, low capital, thus equaling failure. We kind of take it through, kind of leads us to another reason why we don't have these U.S.-based mega firms. So we talked about this already, and what I just simply want to get you to realize is that when we start talking about the poor strategic leadership, if you take anything out of this, and I really want everyone on this webinar to focus on, you know, can we answer the fundamental question, where is our business going the next 10 years? You know, and let's not blame it simply on the nature of the industry, the economic plight that we're in. Because, folks, I'm going to tell you, I work with a lot of businesses, as do my colleagues at FMI, that are making good money. So what's different? Is it serendipity? Are they just, you know, having better luck than you, or are you having better luck than them? What's the cause here? And I would say really using this as this mental checklist to say, what are we doing? Are we innovating? You know, I had the opportunity to hear Gary Hamel, the author I mentioned a little bit earlier, talk, and he talked about innovation. Are we truly innovating as an industry? You know, and I will tell you, at a peer group meeting, I had 8 different CEOs sitting around the table, and they all had iPads. I'm not sure if they slept out for the new iPad or not, but they all had iPads. I was watching it with just a fascination as I was watching them. Either they were listening to me or playing Angry Birds, one or the other. But one of the things that it got me thinking, they said, you know, I bet in a few years our superintendents will be using iPads. And I looked at them and I said, why in a few years? He said, well, it's still kind of cumbersome right now. I said, it's so cumbersome, but everyone in this room simply has one. I said, why are we waiting? Now, I'm not telling everyone to go rush out, even though I do have Apple stock. It would be great to see. But I'm not telling you to rush out and all go buy tablets. But in a lot of cases, we're slow and we don't necessarily think about the business and say, what can we do? You know, where are we going with this business? What kind of tools will enable us to get there faster than the rest of the competition? And what will allow us to be the leaders in our industry, not because of top-line growth, but because of bottom-line management. And I think that's the better piece to recognize. And so as you go through this really today, over the weekend, think about your business, look at these different pieces and say, what do we need to work on? You know, the good news is if you're on this webinar right now, you can easily say there's some things we can do much differently to improve. Here's my information. You'll have to ignore the picture. It is absolutely hideous, I might add. But at the bottom right-hand corner, G. Shotman at FMI Net, here's my phone number. If you can't seem to get a hold of me, you can just reach me here. Actually, as I look at that number, it should be 1259, but I'll tell you, just email me. I will email this program to any of you. There's just some great information. I'll also include some other white papers. But I encourage you to not focus on the failure that you learned about today, but thinking about what you can do to succeed in 2012 and beyond. Once again, I want to thank our partners at Alliance for allowing us this forum. I hope this has been a good webinar for everybody. What I will do now is actually look at the question list. If anybody does have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer. So I'll I'll turn it over to the question section, or the chat section, for lack of a better word. And if for some reason you're shy, you're more than welcome to just email me a question too. I answer pretty quickly, so I'll also stay on for a little longer. But for anybody that does have a question, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, have a great weekend to the folks at Alliance and all the webinar participants wherever you are today. But have a great afternoon.